dear friends of ancient tales, to another peaceful journey through the timeless stories of Greek mythology. Welcome to all who seek the gentle wisdom of the old gods and the quiet comfort of myths whispered beneath Mediterranean stars in the softest hour of twilight, when the world balances between day and dreams. There blooms a flower unlike any other narcissus, pale as moonlight, growing at the edge of a meadow where the earth itself seems to breathe with ancient magic. Before we begin our journey into this eternal tale, if you find comfort in these quiet voyages through mythic realms, please consider subscribing to Greek myths for sleep and leaving a gentle like. Your kindness helps these ancient stories find their way to others who seek peaceful rest, just as you do tonight. Long ago, when the world was younger and the gods walked more freely between heaven and earth, there lived a maiden whose very presence brought flowers to bloom and wheat to ripen. Persephone was her name, daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and Zeus, king of all the gods. She moved through the world like spring itself, her bare feet barely touching the grass as she wandered through meadows that seemed to unfold endlessly beneath the warm Grecian sun. The air around her always carried the scent of wild thyme and honey, of olive blossoms, and the salt-sweet breeze from distant seas. Where she walked, anemones pushed through the dark soil, their petals soft as whispered prayers. The butterflies knew her, dancing around her flowing hair that caught the light like spun gold. Even the bees hummed more gently when she passed, their wings creating a drowsy music that mingled with her quiet songs. Her mother Demeter watched over her with the fierce tenderness that only a mother's heart can hold. Together, they would walk through the fields of mortal farmers, and Demeter would teach her daughter the sacred mysteries of growth and harvest, of seed and soil, of the eternal dance between earth and rain and sun. In those days, the world knew only endless summer, for Demeter's joy in her daughter's company kept the earth in perpetual bloom. The mornings would find them in groves of olive trees, where the silver-green leaves whispered secrets older than memory. Persephone would weave crowns of laurel and myrtle, while her mother spoke of the sacred bonds between gods and mortals, of how the grain must be honored and the earth respected. The young goddess would listen with eyes like dark pools, understanding flowing into her as naturally as rivers flow to the sea. But even in that age of endless golden days, shadows existed deep beneath the earth, in a realm where different rules governed existence. Another god held dominion. Hades, brother to Zeus, ruler of the underworld, presided over a kingdom of quiet souls and eternal rest. His realm was not the place of torment that later stories would make it, but rather a vast, still kingdom where the departed found peace after the struggles of mortal life. The underworld was a place of strange beauty. Rivers of forgetfulness wound through fields of asphodel, those gray flowers that bloom in the space between memory and forgetting. Caverns sparkled with gems, that had never known sunlight, their facets catching the soft glow of phosphorescent stones. It was a realm of eternal twilight, neither harsh nor frightening, but deeply quiet, like the hush that falls over the world in the moments before sleep. Hades himself was not the cruel figure that fear would later paint him as. He was solemn, yes, and bore the weight of his responsibilities with grave dignity. His dark hair fell like shadows around a face carved from marble, and his eyes held depths that had seen every soul pass from life into his care. He was lonely, this king of shadows, for few visited his realm by choice, and fewer still could understand the strange peace he found in his duties to the dead. Sometimes, on days when the weight of solitude pressed particularly heavy upon his broad shoulders, Hades would stand at the borders of his realm, where the roots of the world tree penetrated even into his domain. There, through tiny fissures in the earth, he could sense the world above the warmth of sun on stone, the laughter of nymphs by crystal streams, the songs of shepherds on distant hills. It was on such a day, when loneliness wrapped around him like a cloak woven from shadows, that he first became aware of her. Not through sight, for the earth above was far from his eyes, but through something more subtle, a presence that seemed to bring light even to his awareness. He felt the flowers blooming with unusual vigor, sensed the very earth singing with joy, and knew that something extraordinary moved in the world above. Curiosity stirred in him, an emotion he had thought long buried beneath centuries of duty. Who was this presence that could make even the roots of trees, deep in his realm, seem to pulse with renewed life? The question haunted him through his duties, followed him as he judged the souls brought before his throne, whispered to him in the quiet moments when he walked alone through his vast palace of shadows and starlight. Days passed in the underworld's timeless fashion, but the awareness of that bright presence above never faded. If anything, it grew stronger, like a melody half heard that captures the heart before the mind can understand why. Hades found himself drawn again and again to those borderlands where his realm touched the world of the living, seeking some glimpse or understanding of what stirred him so. Meanwhile, in the sunlit world above, Persephone continued her days of innocent joy. She had grown from child to maiden, her beauty now carrying a quality that drew the eye not through mere prettiness, but through the life force that seemed to radiate from her very being. She was spring personified, potential made manifest, the promise of harvest dwelling in the seed. Her companions were the nymphs of meadow and stream, immortal maidens who delighted in her company. Together, they would dance in circles that had been worn into the grass by countless generations of divine feet, their movements creating patterns that echoed the greater dances of stars and seasons. They would bathe in pools so clear that the pebbles at the bottom seemed to be made of liquid light, and rest in the shade of plane trees, whose leaves sang ancient melodies when the wind passed through. But Persephone, for all her joy in these pleasures, sometimes felt a strange restlessness. In quiet moments, when her companions dozed in the afternoon heat, and even the crickets paused their songs, she would find herself gazing at shadows with curious eyes, not with fear, but with a kind of recognition, as if shadows too were part of some greater tapestry she had yet to understand. She began to wander farther from her usual haunts, drawn by impulses she couldn't name. Her mother, ever watchful, noticed these changes with the sharp awareness that comes from love. Demeter would sometimes find her daughter standing at the edge of deep forests, gazing into green darkness with an expression of thoughtful longing, or she would discover her by caves that breathed cool air from unknown depths, her hand resting on the stone as if listening to messages from below. "What calls to you, my daughter?" Demeter would ask, her voice gentle but tinged with worry. Persephone would turn, her face clearing like sky after clouds pass, and smile with such innocent brightness that her mother's fears would momentarily fade. She would speak of interesting stones she had found, of the patterns moss made on the cave walls, of how different flowers grew where shadow met light. All true things, but not the whole truth, for Persephone herself did not fully understand the pull she felt. The Fates, those three sisters who spin, measure, and cut the threads of all lives, watched these developments with knowing eyes. They alone understood how certain threads were meant to intertwine, how the bright and the dark must dance together to create the full pattern of existence. Their fingers never paused in their work, but perhaps they smiled their ancient smiles as they wove. It was on a day when Demeter had been called away to bless distant fields that Persephone wandered farthest from home. The sun hung like a golden coin in the endless blue of the sky, and the air shimmered with heat that made the distant mountains seem to dance. She had been gathering flowers with her companions, armfuls of poppies red as garnets, daisies white as fresh cream, violets deep as twilight. The meadow they had chosen that day was new to them, discovered by following a stream that chuckled and sang over smooth stones. It spread before them like a tapestry woven by the earth itself, every possible wildflower seeming to grow there in profusion. The nymphs scattered across it like butterflies, their laughter bright as silver bells in the clear air. Persephone wandered deeper into the meadow, her arms already full of blooms, their mingled scents making her pleasantly drowsy. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and she thought she might rest soon, perhaps by the great oak she could see at the meadow's far edge. Its shade looked inviting, a pool of cool darkness in the bright day. As she walked, she noticed something unusual. Near a small rise in the ground, where the earth formed a gentle hill, grew a flower she had never seen before. It stood alone, separate from the riot of colors around it, and something about its solitary beauty called to her. She approached slowly, her divine senses recognizing something significant about this bloom. It was a narcissus, but not like any narcissus she knew. Its petals were white as fresh snow, but at their hearts lay a color that had no name, not quite gold, not quite shadow, but something that seemed to shift between the two like the last light of dusk. Its scent was intoxicating, carrying notes of night-blooming jasmine and something deeper, earthier, like the smell of rich soil after rain. She knelt beside it, her other flowers forgotten, scattered around her like offerings. The narcissus swayed slightly, though no breeze stirred the air. She reached out one hand, her fingers hovering just above its petals, and in that moment felt as if she stood at the edge of something vast and significant. The earth beneath the flower was different too, she noticed. Darker, richer, as if it drew from sources deeper than the usual soil. She could feel life pulsing through it, but a different kind of life than she was used to, not the bright, quick energy of growing things, but something older, more patient, connected to cycles vaster than the turning of seasons. She touched the stem of the narcissus with fingers gentle as butterfly wings, and the flower seemed to lean into her touch. Its scent grew stronger, wrapping around her like silk scarves, like whispered promises, like dreams just before waking. She found herself leaning closer, drawn by something more than curiosity. As her fingers closed around the stem, intending to pluck this marvel to show her mother, she felt the earth beneath her shift, not violently, not with the rage of earthquakes, but with a deep, purposeful movement, like the earth itself drawing breath. The narcissus came free in her hand, its roots trailing dark soil, and where it had grown, she saw that the earth had opened into a fissure. It was not a frightening chasm, not a violent tear in the ground. Instead, it was as if the earth had parted like curtains, revealing depths that glowed with their own soft light. She could see stairs carved from stone so ancient that they seemed part of the world's foundation, leading down into spaces where different stars might shine. From those depths came a sound not frightening, but deeply compelling. It was like wind through caves that had never known sunlight, like the whisper of underground rivers, like the sighs of stones settling into positions they would hold for millennia. And beneath it all, she heard something that might have been her name, spoken not in words, but in the language that earth uses to speak to seeds. She should have been afraid. Any reasonable being would have stepped back, called for help, fled from this opening into unknown realms. But Persephone was a goddess, and more than that, she was the daughter of earth and sky, of growth and power. In her blood ran the ancient understanding that all things must complete their cycles, that what grows upward must also know the depths. She stood at the edge of the fissure, the narcissus still in her hand, its strange fragrance making her thoughts move like honey, slow and golden. She could hear her companions in the distance, their voices like birdsong, unaware that anything had changed. The sun still shone warm on her back, the meadow still bloomed around her, but she stood at a threshold between worlds. From the depths came movement, not sudden or threatening, but inevitable as tide or time. A chariot rose from the earth as smoothly as the moon rises from the horizon, drawn by horses that were not quite horses. Their coats were black as the space between stars. Their manes flowed like shadow made substantial, and their eyes held depths of kindness and ancient knowledge. Holding the reins was a figure that made her divine heart pause in its rhythm. He was tall, taller than mortals dream of being, with the bearing of one who has carried authority since the world was young. His robes were woven from darkness itself, but not the fearsome darkness of nightmares, rather the soft darkness of earth that cradles seeds, of caves that shelter sleepers, of the space behind closed eyelids where dreams are born. His face was beautiful in the way mountains are beautiful severe, eternal, carved by forces greater than any artist's hand. But his eyes, when they met hers, held such loneliness, such deep longing, that she felt her heart move with recognition. Here was one who knew solitude as she knew sunlight, who ruled realms as vast as her mother's, but walked them alone. He stepped from the chariot with movements that spoke of power held in careful check, of strength used always with purpose. When he stood before her, she saw that shadows clung to him like loyal hounds, pooling at his feet, wisping around his shoulders, but never obscuring the quiet dignity of his presence. Neither spoke, for this moment was beyond words. They stood, light and shadow, spring and ending, youth and ancient wisdom, regarding each other across a space that seemed both infinite and intimate. The narcissus in her hand pulsed like a heart, its petals now clearly showing their dual nature, light and dark, swirled together in patterns that spoke of unity, of completion. He extended one hand, palm upward, in a gesture that was both invitation and question. His skin was pale as marble, but warm with the life that runs through all divine beings. She could see in that gesture not command, not force, but an offering of understanding, of kingdoms vast and strange, of companionship in the great dance between light and shadow. The reasonable thing would have been to step back, to return to the sunlit meadow and the safety of her mother's realm. But something in Persephone, that part that had always gazed thoughtfully at shadows, that had wondered at the flowers that bloom in shade, recognized this moment as one written in the very foundations of the world. She placed her hand in his and felt the circuit complete. The world did not end. The sun did not fall from the sky, but something fundamental shifted, like a key turning in a lock that had waited since the beginning of time. His fingers closed around hers with gentle firmness, and she felt through that touch the vastness of his realm, caverns of crystal and rivers of memory, fields where the shadows of all flowers that had ever bloomed swayed in winds that carried the whispers of every story ever told. He drew her toward the chariot with movements so careful, it was clear he expected her to pull away at any moment. But Persephone, though her heart beat quick as a bird's, did not resist. She allowed herself to be handed up into the chariot, noting how the shadow horses turned to nuzzle her hands with velvet soft muzzles, accepting her immediately as their mistress. When he stepped up beside her and took the reins, she felt the power that ran through him, not the bright, burning power of her father's lightning, nor the green, growing power of her mother's earth, but something deeper, older, patient as stone, and inevitable as time. It was power that did not need to announce itself, for it was woven into the very fabric of existence. The horses began to move, and the chariot descended into the earth as smoothly as diving into water. The walls of the passage were not rough stone, but smooth as glass, reflecting their passage in ripples of light and shadow. She could see in those walls the roots of every plant that had ever grown, reaching down like a vast network of life, connecting the bright world above to the dreaming depths below. As they descended, the quality of light changed. The harsh brightness of the sun gave way to a softer luminescence that seemed to come from the very air itself. It was the light of deep places, of caves where crystals grow in patient silence, of the phosphorescence that dances in dark waters. It did not hurt the eyes, but soothed them like the gentle dimness of approaching sleep. The passage opened into a vast realm that took her breath away with its unexpected beauty. This was not the gray land of misery that mortals would later imagine, but a kingdom of subtle wonders. Rivers wound through the landscape like ribbons of liquid starlight. She recognized them from her mother's teachings as the rivers of the Underworld. Styx, the river of oaths, Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, Acheron, the river of woe, Cocytus, the river of lamentation, and Phlegethon, the river of fire. But seeing them here, in their proper context, she understood that these were not rivers of punishment, but of transformation. The Styx glittered with the power of unbreakable vows, its waters carrying the weight of every promise ever made. Lethe flowed gentle and silver, offering not cruel forgetfulness, but merciful release from pain that no longer served. Acheron's dark waters carried away sorrow like a mother washing tears from a child's face. Cocytus sang with the voices of all who had ever mourned, creating a symphony of love remembered, and Phlegethon's flames danced cool and cleansing, burning away only what was ready to be released. The chariot followed a broad road, paved with stones that glowed softly under the horses' hooves. On either side stretched fields of asphodel, their gray blooms creating a sea of gentle movement. Among them wandered the souls of the departed, not as horrible specters, but as beings of soft light, peaceful in their eternal rest. They turned to watch the chariot pass, and in their faces she saw not horror, but a kind of patient contentment, like workers resting after a long day's labor. They passed through groves where trees grew that she had never seen in the upper world. Their leaves were silver and gold and deep purple, and their fruits glowed like lanterns. The air carried scents, both familiar and strange. The earthiness of mushrooms, the sweetness of flowers that bloom only in darkness, the clean smell of deep water, and underneath it all, a fragrance like incense burned in the world's first temple. The palace of Hades rose before them like a mountain carved into architecture. It was built from black marble shot through with veins of silver and gold, its columns reaching up to a ceiling lost in shadow. But for all its grandeur, it did not feel cold or forbidding. Instead, it had the quiet dignity of ancient libraries, of temples where silence is more sacred than song. As the chariot drew to a stop before the great entrance, servants appeared, not the grotesque demons of later tales, but beings of quiet grace, dressed in robes that seemed woven from twilight itself. They bowed deeply to their king and new queen, for already that knowledge was spreading through the realm like ripples in still water. Hades helped her from the chariot with the same careful courtesy he had shown throughout their journey. His hand lingered on hers for a moment, and in his eyes she saw a question he did not yet have words to ask. She saw, too, the depth of his feeling, not the wild passion that her father Zeus showed in his pursuits, but something deeper, more enduring, like rivers that carve canyons through patient persistence. The interior of the palace was a wonder of subtle beauty. The floors were polished obsidian that reflected their steps like dark mirrors. The walls held tapestries that told the stories of every soul who had ever lived, their threads creating patterns of such complexity that the mind could lose itself in following them. Columns of malachite and lapis lazuli supported ceilings painted with constellations that never shone in mortal skies. He led her through halls where fountains played with water that glowed like liquid moonlight, through galleries where statues carved from single gems stood in eternal contemplation, through gardens where flowers made of precious stones bloomed in beds of crushed pearls. Everything spoke of wealth beyond mortal comprehension, but also of loneliness, of beauty created with no one to share it with. Finally, they came to a chamber that made her gasp with wonder. It was a garden, but unlike any garden she had known. Here grew the shadows of every flower that had ever bloomed in the world, above not dark or diminished, but transformed into something new. Roses of deep purple so dark it was almost black bloomed beside lilies that glowed like stars. Vines of shadow jasmine climbed pillars of moonstone, their flowers releasing perfume that was the essence of night itself. In the center of this garden was a throne, and beside it, another throne that looked as if it had been waiting empty since the founding of the world. They were carved from single blocks of stone that seemed to hold starlight in its depths, and around their bases grew flowers she recognized as asphodels, but also poppies for sleep, cypress for eternity, and yes, narcissus for the transformation that brought her here. He turned to her then, and she saw uncertainty in those ancient eyes. When he spoke, his voice was deep as the earth itself, carrying harmonics that resonated in her bones. But no, she reminded herself that this story must be told without direct speech, without quoted words. Instead, she felt his meaning through the connection that had formed when she took his hand. He was offering her not just a throne, but a partnership, not just a realm, but a purpose. He showed her, through images that flowed between their touching hands, the work of ruling the dead not as a tyrant, but as a guardian, ensuring that each soul found its proper place, that the great wheel of existence continued to turn. She saw, too, his loneliness, centuries of it, millennia of watching life from afar, of being necessary, but never loved, honored, but never welcomed. She saw how her presence had already begun to change his realm, flowers blooming that had never bloomed before, the rivers running clearer, the very air growing sweeter with the promise of her influence. But she also felt the growing distress of the world above. Already her mother would be searching. Already the flowers would be wondering why their beloved companion did not return. She stood between worlds, between duties, between loves, both new and old. The underworld held its breath, waiting for her decision. Even the rivers seemed to quiet their flow, and the souls in the fields of asphodel turned toward the palace, as if sensing that their eternal rest hung in the balance of this moment. She walked through the shadow garden, touching each strange bloom, learning their natures through her divine understanding. Here was rest, here was ending, here was transformation, not death as mortals would understand it, but change, necessary and natural, as winter following summer. She began to understand that her mother's realm of eternal growth was only half the story without rest, without ending, without the fallow time. The wheel could not turn properly. At the heart of the garden grew a tree she had not noticed before. It was a pomegranate tree, but like everything here, transformed. Its bark was silver gray, its leaves dark green touched with gold at the edges, and its fruit glowed like rubies lit from within. Each one perfect, each one carrying the concentrated essence of life and death intertwined. She approached the tree slowly, aware that Hades watched her with eyes that held hope and resignation in equal measure. He would not force her, she understood. If she chose to return to the upper world, he would take her there himself, though it would return him to his loneliness. The choice was truly hers. The pomegranate tree seemed to pulse with significance. In its branches, she could see the truth of existence, that life and death were not opposites, but partners in an eternal dance. That her mother's realm needed his as much as his needed hers, that she herself had always carried both within her, the bright flower and the seed that must go into darkness to grow. She reached up and plucked a pomegranate from the branch. It came away easily, settling into her palm with a weight that felt like destiny. The fruit was warm, almost alive, and when she split it open, the seeds within gleamed like drops of blood, garnets, like tiny suns that had learned to shine in darkness. The scent that rose from the broken fruit was indescribable. It held summer and winter, joy and sorrow, beginning and ending, all married into something that transcended such simple divisions. She understood then that this was the fruit of knowledge, not of good and evil, but of the necessity of cycles, of the beauty in endings that lead to new beginnings. She took 6 seeds in her palm, their faceted surfaces catching the strange light of the underworld garden. 6 seeds, she thought, for the 6 months when the earth must rest, when the fields must lie fallow, when even gods must acknowledge that constant growth without pause leads not to abundance, but to exhaustion. As she raised the seeds to her lips, she felt the attention of all the underworld upon her. The dead in their fields, the rivers in their courses, the very stones of the palace, all waited to see if their queen would truly choose them, would bind herself to their realm, not through force or trickery, but through understanding. The seeds burst on her tongue with flavor beyond mortal description. They tasted of earth after rain, of the last apple of autumn, of the first flower of spring. They tasted of promises kept and transformations accepted. Most of all, they tasted of completion, of a circle closing that had been broken since the world began. As she swallowed, she felt the change ripple through her. Not a diminishment, but an expansion. She was still Persephone, still the maiden of flowers. But now she was also something more. She was the queen who knew both realms, who could walk in sunlight and shadow with equal grace. She was the bridge between her mother's world and her husband's, the force that would make the wheel of seasons turn. Hades, her husband now, she realized with a thrill that was part fear and part joy, approached her slowly. His face showed wonder, as if he could not quite believe what had happened. When he reached out to touch her hand, she met him halfway, and in their joined hands bloomed a flower that had never existed before, a rose that was both light and shadow, both spring and winter, both beginning and ending. But even as she accepted her new role, even as she felt the underworld accepting her as its queen, she also felt the distress of the world above. Her mother's grief was beginning to touch the earth, and the flowers were starting to wilt. The eternal summer was ending, and the world did not understand why. She knew she must return, at least for a time, to explain, to comfort, to help the world understand the new order that had begun. But she also knew that she would return here, to this realm of quiet wonders, to the husband who looked at her as if she were the first light ever to shine in his darkness. The pomegranate seeds bound her, yes, but it was a binding she had chosen. 6 seeds for 6 months, half the year in shadow, half in light, forever moving between the worlds, forever joining what others saw as separate. As she stood in the garden of shadows, with her husband's hand in hers, and the taste of pomegranate still sweet on her lips, she felt the rightness of it all. This was her destiny, not to choose between light and dark, to dance between them, to be the force that married opposite into harmony. The underworld began to transform around her, responding to its new queen. Flowers bloomed among the asphodel, not replacing them, but complementing them, adding color to the gentle gray. The rivers sang with new voices, carrying not just endings, but the promise of beginnings. The palace itself seemed to warm, as if her presence had awakened something that had always been there, waiting. In the world above, Demeter searched for her daughter with growing desperation. The goddess of harvest walked the earth, and where she passed, the flowers hung their heads and the grain forgot to grow. Her grief was terrible to behold, for what is more devastating than a mother's loss? She questioned every nymph, every god, every mortal who might have seen her daughter, but none could tell her where Persephone had gone. The sun himself, Helios, who sees all that happens beneath his daily journey, finally took pity on the grieving mother. From his chariot of fire, he spoke to her of what he had witnessed the earth opening, the chariot of shadows, the maiden who had gone willingly into the depths. He told her of her daughter's new estate, of the crown of shadows that now graced her brow alongside her crown of flowers. Demeter's grief transformed into rage, then into a cold determination. She withdrew her blessings from the earth. The harvest failed, the seeds refused to sprout, the trees held tight to their fruits and let them rot rather than ripen. Mortals began to suffer, their prayers rising like smoke to Olympus, begging for the return of the goddess' favor. In the underworld, Persephone felt her mother's pain like a physical ache. She stood in her new throne room, magnificent in robes that seemed woven from midnight and starlight, but her heart was heavy. She had not meant to cause such suffering. She had thought only to follow her destiny, to complete the pattern that had been partial for so long. Her husband understood her sorrow, for he had known separation from family since the division of the world among the three brothers. He offered to release her from her vows, to return her to the sunlight, though she could see what the offer cost him. But she shook her head, knowing that simple solutions would not serve here. The seeds had been eaten, the choice made. What was needed was not reversal, but understanding. Zeus, king of the gods, found himself forced to intervene as the mortal's prayers became desperate and the earth itself began to die. He sent Hermes, messenger of the gods, to negotiate between the estranged mother and the newly wed couple. Hermes, wise in the ways of mediation, flew between the realms with the speed of thought, carrying messages and proposals. The solution, when it came, was elegant in its simplicity. For the number of seeds she had eaten, Persephone would spend that many months each year in the underworld as its queen. The rest of the year, she would return to her mother and the upper world, bringing with her the spring and all growing things. It was a compromise that honored both realms, both duties, both loves. When Persephone first returned to the surface after her months below, the reunion with her mother was bittersweet. Demeter embraced her daughter with joy that made the whole earth bloom in sympathy. But she also saw the change in her. Persephone was no longer simply the maiden of flowers. Shadows dwelt in her eyes now, and wisdom, and a quiet authority that spoke of queens and deeper mysteries. As they talked through the night, mother and daughter, Persephone shared what she had learned in the realm below. She spoke of the necessity of rest, of how the earth itself needed time to lie fallow and gather strength. She told of the souls who found peace in her husband's realm, of the rivers that washed away pain, of the strange beauty that existed in endings that led to new beginnings. Slowly, Demeter began to understand. The eternal summer she had created was beautiful, but ultimately stagnant. Without winter, there could be no true spring. Without rest, there could be no renewal. Her daughter had not been stolen, but had chosen a path that would bring balance to the world. And so, the seasons were born. When Persephone descended to her shadow realm, Demeter's grief would touch the earth, and winter would come. The leaves would fall, the fields would sleep beneath blankets of snow, and all of nature would rest. But even in the deepest winter, there was no despair, for all knew that the Queen of Shadows was also the bringer of spring, and she would return. When she rose again to the surface, joy would race across the land. Flowers would push through the last snow, trees would bud with impossible speed, and the whole world would celebrate the return of the maiden who had become a queen. Demeter would walk the earth with her daughter, and their combined power would bring forth harvests of unprecedented abundance. In the underworld, during her absence, Hades would tend to his duties with the patience of eternity, knowing that his queen would return. The pomegranate tree in the shadow garden would bloom in her absence and fruit upon her return, marking the eternal cycle. The dead would speak of their queen with love, for she brought gentleness to their king and beauty to their realm. As the years passed and the seasons turned in their new rhythm, mortals learned to honor both aspects of the divine feminine, the bright mother of harvests and the dark queen of mysteries. They understood that Persephone's journey was not a tragedy, but a sacred teaching about the necessary balance of all things. In spring, they would celebrate her return with festivals of flowers, dancing in meadows and giving thanks for the renewal of life. Young maidens would wear crowns of flowers in her honor, and the first fruits would be offered at her altars. But they also honored her shadow aspect, understanding that the queen who brought spring was also the queen who comforted the dead. In autumn, as she prepared to descend again, they would hold different rites quieter, more contemplative. They would honor the harvest, but also prepare for the necessary rest to come. They would remember their own dead, understanding that Persephone would care for them in her shadow realm with the same tenderness she showed to the flowers of spring. The gods themselves were changed by this new understanding. Where once they had seen only divisions, sky and earth, light and dark, life and death, they now now saw the connections. Persephone had become the great mediator, the one who proved that apparent opposites were actually partners in the great dance of existence. Even Hades was transformed by his marriage. The stern king of shadows learned to smile, and sometimes laughter would echo through the halls of his palace, a sound that made the dead lift their heads in wonder. He created new wonders in his realm to delight his queen. Gardens where jeweled flowers sang soft melodies, libraries where the stories of every life were preserved in books of shadow and starlight, galleries where the dreams of the dead were displayed like art. During her time below, Persephone would hold court beside her husband, and the dead would come before her with their stories. She would listen with compassion, helping them find peace with their endings, preparing them for whatever came next. She discovered that she had a gift for this work, the same understanding that helped her know what each seed needed to grow also helped her know what each soul needed to find rest. The pomegranate became her symbol, appearing in art and story as the fruit of necessary choices, of wisdom gained through experiencing both sides of existence. Mortals would plant pomegranate trees by graves, knowing that their loved ones were in the care of a queen who understood both joy and sorrow, both greeting and farewell. Sometimes, on the border between seasons, mortals would report strange sights. A figure crowned with both flowers and shadows, walking through fields at twilight. Flowers that bloomed out of season, carrying the scent of pomegranates. Shadows at noon that seemed to dance with their own life. These were the times when Persephone walked between the worlds, neither fully in one realm nor the other, but perfectly balanced between them. The other gods learned to respect her unique position. When disputes arose between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, it was Persephone who would mediate. When mortals needed to understand the mysteries of death, it was to her they prayed. When the dying needed comfort, they called upon the queen who knew both sides of the veil. Her marriage to Hades became one of the great love stories of the divine realm, not a story of abduction and force, but of choice and understanding. They ruled their realm as equals, each bringing their own gifts to the partnership. Where he was stern, she was gentle. Where she was bright, he was steady. Together, they created a kingdom that was both an ending and a beginning, a place of rest that was also a place of transformation. The pomegranate seeds that had bound her became a symbol of something greater than binding. They represented the choices we make that change us forever, the thresholds we cross that lead to new understanding. Every soul that came to the underworld was offered pomegranate juice, not to trap them, but to help them understand that they had entered a new phase of existence, one that required different wisdom than the sunlit world above. As the ages turned and the world changed, the story of Persephone's descent was told and retold. Sometimes the tellers would emphasize the sorrow, painting it as a tale of loss. But those who understood knew better. They knew it was a story of finding oneself in unexpected places, of discovering that our destinies often lie not in the bright spaces we expect, but in the shadows we learn not to fear, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world balanced between night and day. Prayers would rise to the Queen of Two Realms. Farmers prayed for her blessing on seeds that must go into darkness to sprout. Women in childbirth called upon she who understood the passage between worlds. The grieving sought comfort from the Queen, who spent half her time with the dead, and so could carry messages between the realms. The underworld itself evolved under her influence. Where once it had been a place merely of ending, it became a place of transformation. The rivers still flowed with their ancient purposes, but now they were bordered with gardens where the souls could rest and reflect. The palace of Hades became a place of learning, where the dead could understand the patterns of their lives, see the threads that connected all things. Music came to the underworld, with its queen not the bright songs of Olympus, but deeper melodies that spoke of earth and stone, of roots and rivers. The dead learned to sing again, their voices joining in harmonies that told the great story of existence from a perspective only they could know. These songs would sometimes be heard in the upper world, carried on the wind at twilight, reminding the living that death was not an ending, but a transformation. Persephone established schools in the underworld, places where souls could learn what they had missed in life. Heroes learned wisdom to balance their strength. Scholars found libraries containing all the knowledge that had been lost to the upper world. Artists discovered new forms of beauty that could only be perceived by those who had passed through the ultimate transformation. The love between Persephone and Hades deepened with each passing season. Their reunions after her months above were celebrations that made the whole underworld bloom with shadow flowers. Their partings were sorrowful but bearable, for they knew the wheel would turn and bring them together again. In this, they became teachers to all who loved, showing that true love could survive separation. That distance could make hearts grow not colder, but more appreciative. In the upper world, shrines to Persephone appeared at boundaries, at the edges of forests, at cave mouths, at crossroads. These were places where the veil between worlds was thin, where her influence could be felt most strongly. Offerings were left there. Pomegranates, of course, but also flowers that bloomed in shade, black stones polished smooth, poems written about transformations. Her mother Demeter learned to find joy even in the fallow months. She would travel then, visiting mortals in disguise, teaching them the deeper mysteries of the earth. She would speak of her daughter with pride, now rather than only sorrow, pride in the queen she had become, in the wisdom she had gained, in the balance she had brought to all the realms. The mysteries of Eleusis arose from this understanding, sacred rites where mortals could learn the secrets of life and death, of the eternal cycle that Persephone embodied. Initiates would emerge from these rites changed, no longer fearing death, but understanding it as another phase of existence, presided over by a queen who had walked both paths and found beauty in both. Children were told the story as a comfort that when their time came to journey to the underworld, they would be met by a queen who remembered sunlight, who would guide them gently into their new existence. The old faced their endings with less fear, knowing that the queen of the dead was also the bringer of spring, that in her realm, endings and beginnings were one. Artists painted her with symbols of both her natures crowned with flowers, but robed in shadows, holding pomegranates and poppies, standing at thresholds with one foot in darkness and one in light. Poets sang of her as the completion of all things, the marriage of opposites that made existence whole. Even the narcissus, the flower that had begun her transformation, became sacred. It grew now at boundaries, at places of change, its pale petals reminding all who saw it that sometimes our destinies come to us in unexpected forms, that what seems like chance might be the unfolding of patterns too vast for mortal understanding. In the underworld's deepest halls, Persephone discovered chambers that even Hades had never fully explored. These were the places where the universe kept its deepest mysteries, the patterns that governed not just mortal lives, but the lives of gods, the cycles that even Zeus must bow to. She studied these mysteries with the patience of one who had eternity to understand, becoming wise in ways that surpassed even ancient goddesses. She learned the true names of things, the words that had called existence into being. She learned why death was necessary for life, why endings enabled beginnings, why even gods must change or become stagnant. This wisdom she shared carefully, for such knowledge was not for all, but those who were ready would find their way to her teachings. The pomegranate tree in the shadow garden grew ancient and mighty, its roots reaching deep into the foundations of the world, its branches touching the ceiling of the underworld sky. Each fruit that grew upon it contained the concentrated wisdom of a completed life. And sometimes Persephone would offer these fruits to souls who had earned such gifts through their journey. As the world above changed, as mortals built cities and forgot the old ways, as new gods arose and old ones faded, Persephone remained constant. She was the eternal cycle, the promise that no matter how much changed on the surface, the deeper patterns endured. Spring would follow winter, life would follow death, and always the queen of two realms would guide the transformation. In the latest days, when mortals had almost forgotten the gods entirely, she could still be felt in the first flower pushing through spring snow, in the comfort that came to the grieving, in the peace of autumn afternoons when the world prepared for rest. She had become less a personality than a force of nature, but a force that retained compassion, understanding, the memory of what it was to choose one's destiny. The underworld evolved into something beyond even Hades' imagining. Under Persephone's influence, it became not just a realm of the dead, but a place where all transformations were honored. Souls learned not just to accept their deaths, but to understand them as part of a grander pattern. They discovered that what they had thought were endings were actually doorways, and Persephone stood at each threshold, guide and guardian, queen and gardener of souls. And still, each year, the cycle turned. Still, she descended and rose, carrying spring in her footsteps and wisdom in her shadow. Still, the pomegranate seeds marked the rhythm of the world, 6 sweet drops of destiny that had changed everything. Still, Hades waited for her return with the patience of stone and the faithfulness of rivers that never cease their flow. The story settled into the bones of the world, became part of the great unconscious understanding that all beings carry. Even those who never heard the names of the gods knew in their hearts that winter was not death, but rest, that spring was not birth, but return, that in every ending lay the seeds of beginning. And in the space between the worlds, where light married shadow and time moved differently, a figure walked in eternal beauty, crowned with asphodels and asphodel shadows, robed in the colors of sunset and dawn. She moved between realms with the grace of one who had found her perfect place, not in light alone, not in shadow alone, but in the dance between them. Persephone, forever maiden and forever queen, forever spring and forever autumn, forever rising and forever descending. In her, all opposites found their resolution. In her, the great wheel of existence found its center. In her, every soul found the promise that transformation was not to be feared, but embraced, that every descent could become an ascent, that in the marriage of light and shadow lay the secret of existence itself. The pomegranate seeds had been swallowed, the choice made, the pattern completed. And in that completion, the world found its rhythm, the seasons found their reason, and all who lived and died found their guide through the great mystery. As this tale draws toward its close, as the words begin to fade like flowers at twilight, we return to that eternal garden where shadow blooms release their fragrance into air that has never known harsh sun. There Persephone sits upon her throne, and if you were to see her now, you would understand that she has become something more than goddess. She has become truth itself, the truth that binds all things in their eternal dance. Her eyes, when they open, hold the depth of earth that cradles seeds and the height of sky where spring clouds gather. In her hands, she holds a pomegranate, forever fresh, forever ready to teach its lesson to those who dare to taste transformation. Around her, the souls of the dead move like gentle mists, each carrying their story, each finding peace in her presence. And Hades, her dark king, her chosen companion, sits beside her with the contentment of one who has learned that love is not possession, but partnership, not binding, but choosing again and again to walk the same path together. Their hands touch across the space between their thrones, and in that touch flows the power that turns the world. Above, in the realm of sunlight, Demeter feels her daughter's contentment and smiles, her blessing flowing out to sleeping fields that wait for spring. The earth itself dreams, resting in the embrace of winter, gathering strength for the explosion of life that will come with Persephone's return. This is the rhythm now, as natural as breathing, as necessary as heartbeat. The story spirals on, as all true stories do, without ending, only transformation. Each year brings the same cycle, but also new understanding. Each descent teaches different lessons. Each spring brings flowers that have never bloomed before, carrying in their petals the wisdom gained in darkness. And you who listen, you who have followed this tale through its winding paths, you too are part of this story, for in every choice you make that changes you forever, you eat of the pomegranate. In every transformation you undergo, willing or unwilling, you walk with Persephone between the worlds. In every ending that becomes a beginning, you participate in the great mystery she embodies. Sleep comes now like a gentle river, carrying you toward dreams where flowers bloom in starlight and shadows dance with color. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself in a garden where every path leads both up toward light and down toward depth. You might taste fruit that carries the flavor of your own transformations, sweet and complex and necessary. Let the story settle into your bones like seeds into earth. Let it wait there through the night's darkness, gathering power, preparing to bloom into new understanding when you wake. For this is Persephone's gift, not just the turning of seasons, but the promise that every descent carries within it the certainty of return, that every journey into darkness is also a journey toward a different kind of light. The immortal lovers sit eternal on their thrones of shadow and starlight, hands joined across the space between worlds. The pomegranate tree blooms eternal in the garden where flowers are memories and memories are flowers. The rivers flow eternal, washing away what needs releasing, carrying forward what needs preserving. And somewhere, in the space between sleeping and waking, between ending and beginning, between the last word of this story and the first breath of your dreams, Persephone walks. Her footsteps leave flowers in shadow and shadows in light, marking the path that all souls travel, the great journey from known to unknown and back again. Rest now. Let the tale carry you into sleep's gentle kingdom, where Morpheus, friend to the Queen of Shadows, will paint your dreams with colors drawn from both realms. And know that when spring comes again, as it always does, as it always will, it comes because once upon a time, a maiden tasted pomegranate seeds and chose to become a queen, chose to join what others would keep separate, chose to dance eternal between light and shadow. The story ends as all stories must, not with ending, but with transformation. The words fade into whispers, whispers into silence, silence into the soft breathing of sleep. And in that silence, if you listen with the ears of dream, you might hear it still the eternal story, told by wind and river, by flower and shadow, by the turning of the seasons themselves. Persephone descends. Persephone rises. The wheel turns. The story continues. Sleep well, dear listener. Dream deep. And when you wake, remember you too carry both flowers and shadows. You too know both rising and descent. You too are part of the eternal dance between light and dark. In this knowledge lies peace. In this peace lies sleep. The underworld quiets. The upper world rests. Between them, in the space where all possibilities dwell, a queen walks in beauty, forever transforming, forever transformed, forever teaching the gentle truth that in every ending blooms a beginning, in every shadow lives a light.